Welcome to the Weekly Roar, coming live from the Lion's Den, helping new managers become great leaders and awesome bosses. And now, here's your host, Greg Storch.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the Lion's Den. This is the Weekly Roar. Today, we're continuing the series called Effective Thinking, Your Pathway to Success. And I'm going to talk about another skill that we can develop to help us become more effective thinkers. This one is about how we can gain certainty and security as leaders. You're going to hear more about this in just a second. But first, I'm Greg Storch. I'm the owner of Lion Enterprise, a leadership development and coaching business, and the founder of a worldwide bartered coaching program called The Helping Hand. I'm a certified professional leadership coach and a certified leadership speaker and trainer. Now, last week, we came together in the Lion's Den as I spoke about the importance for us to be creative in our thinking. Creative thinking is our ability to look at the ideas or a scenario and find new alternatives or approaches to them. I shared some of the characteristics of creative thinkers and some of the practices that you can use to get better at it. Hopefully, you spent time assessing where you sit with that particular skill on a scale of 1 to 10 as far as your creative thinking goes. Now, once you make that assessment, think about what actions you need to take that are going to move you from where you rated yourself last week to the next number on that rating scale. If you aren't sure what actions you might need to take, let's connect after this and just talk about how my coaching might help you address that. If you aren't sure about coaching and you're curious what that would be like, you can book a free 30-minute discovery session with me to find out. Think of it as test driving a new car. I'm going to put the link to my schedule right here below. Now, if you weren't able to join us last Wednesday for the Weekly Roar, or if you just want to catch up and watch that session over again, all you have to do is head over to my website at www.lion-enterprise.com and click on the Lion's Pride Library menu to find video number 115 for last week. Hey, and while you're in the Lion's Pride Library, stick around and check it out. It's a free resource, and it's a great way for you to get more of the roar. Okay, let's get this party started. Today's episode is called Time for a Reality Check. Now, I tend to be a realistic thinker, but the problem with realistic thinking is that it can come across in a negative way. We all have an idea of how we would like things to turn out for ourselves, but sometimes there's a gap between what we're dreaming about and the reality of the situation. Being a realistic thinker, in my opinion, allows us to have a balanced approach to our decision making, and as a leader, that can be a valuable asset for us. I think it's a helpful way to actually get away from negative thinking, to be honest. Realistic thinking means looking at all aspects of a situation, the positive, the negative, and the neutral, before making conclusions. In other words, realistic thinking means looking at yourself, other people, and the world in a balanced and fair way. It's a great way to bring awareness to our thoughts and to challenge them. Now, there are many of you who may tend to be optimistic naturally. We've spent a lot of time growing in this area, so I know you do. And if you consider yourself to be an optimistic person, then you might be sitting there right now wondering why you would want to become a more realistic thinker. See, the thing is that cultivating realistic thinking isn't going to diminish your optimism. It's just another way to add more value to yourself. Now, here are a few things that realistic thinking can do for us if we're willing to put in the effort to think more realistically. Now, first of all, realistic thinking can make you a better risk evaluator. One thing I know for sure is that in order to achieve anything we want, we have to take the appropriate actions to do it. And anytime we take actions, there's consequences to taking those actions, right? Well, realistic thinking helps you to consider what those consequences might be. And when we have a wider view of all of the things that could happen, it helps us to better plan for them. While we hope for the best outcome, we also know that hope is not a method. Realistic thinking encourages us to consider the other options. Of course, we don't want things to go wrong, but people who engage in realistic thinking know that that's always a possibility. They have a backup plan in place because they want to be as prepared as possible if the best outcome doesn't turn out to be a reality. Second, realistic thinking can provide us with a sense of security. We can actually gain confidence from it because realistic thinking helps us to think through even the worst that can happen. And that helps us develop contingency plans to address those possible issues. When I was deployed with the Marines overseas in Iraq as a medical planner, I had to brief the commander on medical related issues every time we were going to take some sort of action. In that brief, I would provide the background on the current situation. And then I would always provide 3 courses of action that could be taken for a favorable outcome. And I would also make recommendations on which of those 3 actions I would recommend taking and why I recommended it. This was the commander's way of thinking realistically. He was able to look at the scenario from all angles before he had to make a decision on which course of action he was going to take. You've probably heard the saying that disappointment is the difference between our expectations and reality. Well, if that's true, then realistic thinking is what helps us close that gap between those two. Now, the third benefit of realistic thinking is really important for leaders, and that is that it can help you gain credibility. You know, my mentor, John Maxwell, has a pretty famous quote that says, "People buy into the leader before they buy into their vision." Well, one of the ways that people buy into their leader is through having credibility. How does that happen? Realistic thinkers look at all the possible outcomes to an action. And when they do, they're better prepared to meet challenges they face. So when a leader is prepared and can meet challenges, they gain credibility with their followers from the confidence that they have. I want to share with you is that realistic thinking helps us to grow. Sometimes realistic thinking forces us to face things we don't want to face. And sometimes it requires us to make changes. Facing reality can make us clearly see the need for change. And while growth in and of itself doesn't bring growth, it's a necessary ingredient to our growth. You have to have change in order to grow. Okay, so let's get to the meat of this realistic thinking discussion. You might be asking, how do I get better at doing this? How can I become a better realistic thinker? Now, if that's you, then here are some of the things you can start doing to get better at thinking more realistically. I think you'll remember that movie, A Few Good Men. And if you do, then you probably remember the infamous line by Colonel Jessup, who was played by Jack Nicholson when he said, "You can't handle the truth." Okay, wasn't that great? Well, In order to improve your realistic thinking, you're going to have to learn to appreciate the truth. It's going to require that you look at and enjoy the truth, even if it isn't what you want to see. Facing the truth isn't an easy thing to do for a lot of people. That may be why they say the truth hurts. But when we face the truth, reality, we're allowing ourselves to be honest. And James Faust said it best when he said, honesty is more than not lying. It is truth telling, truth speaking, truth living, and truth loving. Now, I'm not really sure what it is about the truth that so many want to avoid, but avoiding it only limits us and contributes more to failure than it does to our success. Now, if you want to get better at becoming a more realistic thinker, then be ready to get comfortable dealing with the truth and facing it head on. The truth won't cost you a dime, but lying to yourself or ignoring it could cost you everything. You know, when I was growing up, I remember watching a show called Dragnet. Some of you may remember that one. There was a character on that show called Sergeant Joe Friday, and he had this famous line that he always said when he was interviewing a lady. Some of you probably just said it in your heads. That's right. It was just the facts, ma'am. Well, realistic thinkers deal with just the facts. And in order to deal with the facts, you're going to have to do some homework. We can't, or we shouldn't, make decisions based on bad information or assumptions. The truth, see what I did there, is that we just can't do our best thinking without facts. When I say that we have to do our homework, one of the things you can do is research what others have done in similar situations. Remember what I told you last week when I spoke about creative thinking. You know, thought doesn't have to be original, but it should be solid. There's no shame in learning all you can from other good thinkers who have had successful outcomes in similar situations to the ones you're working on. Heck, some of my best thinking is done by my wife. Hey, have you ever had to make a decision and took the time to make a list of the pros and cons before making that decision? That's a great way to get a strong dose of reality, don't you think? Well, I want to share a little secret with you. Do you realize that the exercise of creating that list isn't really to make the decision easy by simply selecting the option that has more pros than it does cons? Actually, that's kind of a bad way to do it, because what we're not doing is taking into account the different weights that are carried on each of the pros and cons. They're all weighted differently. Now, the real benefit to going through that exercise is that it helps us dig into the facts and to help us look at it from all different angles. That's where the value is in making that pros and cons list. So, to help you become a better realistic thinker, go through the drill of thinking in to the pros and cons. And then another way to get better at thinking realistically is to think in terms of worst case scenario. That doesn't mean you have to be a negative Nancy or a negative Ned, but to think in these terms, just ask yourself questions that are opposite of the optimal outcome. So if your optimal outcome is that your client pays you on time, you can think in terms of the worst case scenario by asking, what if my client doesn't pay me? What if I don't win? What if nobody shows up? What if I get rejected? All of those kind of questions force us to look at worst case scenario, and we should do that regardless of what we're doing, whether we're running our own business or managing a department or even working at home on our personal finances. Now, I'm going to caveat this by saying the goal is not to be negative or to always expect the worst. It's simply to be ready. To be ready in the event the worst does happen. And being ready for it helps us to react to it and deal with it more successfully. It places us in a position of power over our circumstances. Now, the last thing that you can do to work on getting better with realistic thinking is take an inventory of your resources. What do you have readily at your disposal? And this is how that can help you think more realistically. When we look at our pros and cons and examine worst case scenarios, we end up being able to see the gap where we want to be and our reality of our current situation. But the good news is that once you identify those gaps, once you know where they are, you can start using your resources to address the gaps and fill them in. And that brings you closer to your desired state. You know, there are a lot of people who think that realistic thinking is negative thinking, especially people who are naturally optimistic. But those who avoid realistic thinking tend to default to idealistic thinking when it comes time for decision making. Unfortunately, that can lead to skipping over the important realities that should be faced. And when that happens, the final decision that gets made often ends up in disappointment. And this is why I wanted to bring this type of thinking, this skill, to your attention. It isn't a default way for us to think, but it's a helpful skill to develop, especially for leaders. You know, in my opinion, the best mix is what I call an optimistic realist. Some of the most successful leaders function best when they have a healthy dose of forward-thinking optimism and down-to-earth realism, because these pragmatic minds know how to combine the positive outlook of an optimist with the sharp-eyed view of a realist. Okay, everyone, there you have it. There's the fourth skill that you can assess to improve and become a more effective thinker. So, on your assessment for thinking more realistically, just ask yourself this simple question. Before I make a key decision, how can I build a solid foundation on facts so I can think with certainty? Where are you with this one on a scale from 1 to 10? And what do you need to do? And what do you need to do to move one number closer to 10 from where you are right now? Well, next week, I'm going to talk about the benefits of being able to apply strategic thinking to your everyday life and why you should spend more time planning your life than you do planning your vacation. If you want to hear more about how to use strategic thinking in your life, then just come on back to the Lion's Den and tune into the Weekly Roar next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. All right, everybody, that does it. Thank you so much for supporting me and watching the Weekly Roar today. I truly appreciate you, and I love having you here with me. I love all the comments you're putting there, so let's keep the dialogue going. Until we meet again next Wednesday, remember, be powerful, but stay poised just like a lion. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching the Weekly Roar live event at lionenterprise.com. If you enjoyed this video, please tell others to join us each week here in the Lion's Den. Thanks again, and see you next week.